Hi there, everyone, and welcome to the latest OpenChain webinar. Today is the second webinar in the series we're doing with Open Forum Europe. So the last time we had a look at the Cyber Resilience Act, and today we're having a look at the EU AI Act. Our speaker today is once again Kieran O'Riordan, who has a deep background in not just how open source works and policy works in Brussels, but also in the background back and forth that leads to the emergence of policy. We're very fortunate to have a chance to not only have the presentation live today, but also to record it and make it generally available to people around the world in the future. Now, before we get started, as always, I'll just show our antitrust policy notice. You can find the full antitrust policy on the Linux Foundation website. If you're from a member company, you can ask questions of our counsel, Andy Updegrove. For those of you who would like some background on the EU AI Act, there's a little bit of information here coming straight from the EU itself. So the Europa platform, which is used to publish a lot of the official information, documentation, reference material of the European Union, cites the EU AI Act as the first ever legal framework on AI. And it's designed from the perspective of those behind it to address the risks of AI and to take a leading role globally in its regulation. The idea of outlining requirements and obligations and doing so quickly in a fast-moving environment is naturally a positive concept, trying to ensure that policy can follow technology. The question to address is, what does it contain? What does it mean to us? What type of impact will it have? And that's what we'll be discussing today. Kieran, our speaker, is someone who has been in the space for a long time. He's been around open source software for around 20 years or more. And he's based at Open Forum Europe, which is a nonprofit. It's based in Brussels, and it's a think tank that essentially brings people with knowledge together, fosters discussions, and helps make sure that if we're talking about openness, we have credible people at the table to help unpack the issues at hand. Now, I don't want to take up time on this talk, Kieran. I'd love to hand straight over to you and to give you the floor. Do you want me to stop sharing so that you can share your screen?
So can you now see my slides?
Yep, it's looking great.
Perfect. Okay, thank you very much. So when I was preparing this presentation, one of the most difficult things was to decide what goes in and what has to be left out. There's a lot of presentations online that will spend 2 hours discussing just the EU AI Act or just the situation of what is free and open source software going to do on the topic of AI, and then also on the technical details. To really understand the topic, though, you have to have a base in all three of these areas. So I've tried to get the most relevant aspects of each and present these for in a way that makes the other aspects understandable. So the document that I will be referencing for the EU AI Act is the most recent one. I've put a link there in my slide, which will be distributed after the presentation. I'll just check if I can put that link in the chat. I hope everyone has received it. So this is just because there are various drafts that were published over the last few months, and each one seemed to be called a final draft, but they all had different numbering. So for the articles and recitals that I will mention, these are the numbers that I will use. So one aspect that makes this topic difficult is that we don't really have many experts who understand both policy and artificial intelligence. And this is different to other domains because we often had policy issues around copyright or around patents. And the technical knowledge that our policy people have was sufficient because a lot of our policy people, they may have been IT staff or software developers at some stage in their career, and then they moved into policy. And so they end up having these two domains. However, for the specific domain of artificial intelligence, things are moving quite quickly, and that's the reason for the new policy being proposed. And so the technical knowledge that our policy people have is often technical knowledge that is from before the explosion of what's being called AI now. So this makes it a little bit difficult. Then, of course, the other thing is that we had in the EU an enormous amount of digital policy in the last 3 years in particular. The Cyber Resilience Act was the one that got a lot of attention, but there was also the Digital Markets Act and the Data Act and Product Liability Directive and many other files that we have been working on at the same time. So one small thing to explain is that the AI Act is a regulation. And so there's two main types of law in the EU, and a regulation applies directly to the member states. So it doesn't require any laws to be written in the member states to implement this. The next issue then is if we look at the definition of what is an AI system in the context of the EU AI Act. And so there's a block of text, but I've broken it down into four criteria, although one of them is not clear whether it's a criteria. So the first one, it's machine-based, which is quite general. We expect that. It's designed to operate with varying levels of autonomy. It's not really clear what limit that puts on the definition, so that's not too important. It may exhibit adaptiveness, and well, if the word may says that it's optional, then that's not really part of the definition. And so then the important part is really this last part, that it infers from input and takes decisions. And so this is just, it's interesting to be aware that it's a very broad definition. There's not much that would be excluded, and it's possible even that some types of computing that people would not consider to be artificial intelligence would be included then in this definition. On that note, I should mention that there is discussion over whether the term artificial intelligence is even appropriate, because there's machine learning and a few other terms, and some would categorize artificial intelligence as a subset of one, or machine learning as being a subset of the other. And however, for the definition here, it's quite broad, and so it would include most of the topics that people would expect or people would hear being linked with artificial intelligence. The second thing to take from this definition is that it's quite unclear in many ways. And so there are some other parts of the text that will clarify some aspects, but there are also quite a few debates over what each of these words means and whether the differences of meaning could be important. So in terms of scope, the EU AI Act applies to people who are placing products on the market. And so this is when you make something available for the first time to people in the EU. When you're putting AI into a service, into service, which is another terminology that comes from a thing called the Blue Guide. And then the last one is that the AI Act applies also to people who are using AI, because this is a deployment. So these terms, they don't always mean what we expect them to mean. And sometimes we've been using these terms differently in our own projects and communities. And so it's worth keeping an eye on the individual terms. The reason for using some terms that are not very natural is because these terms are well defined in a thing called the Blue Guide in the EU. Now, when I say they're well defined, they may not be frequently used in the context of software. So sometimes they have a lot of documents explaining the definition of a certain word, but it may be from the context of hardware. And so sometimes these words, their application to the software domain isn't clear, but they will continue to be used simply because they're in the Blue Guide. And hopefully the Blue Guide at some stage will be improved to clarify these things. So the good news is that some clarifications were introduced for free and open source software. We sometimes call these exemptions, and I'm not sure if that's really the right term, because in many ways, free and open source software, because it is distributed by more entities and it is more likely to be distributed than to be provided as a service. Sometimes we actually end up with more compliance. So I think it's not very clear if we say that we have an exemption and we're actually having to perform more compliance. So I call them clarifications, but this clarification in Article 2 says that free and open source software is outside the scope of these obligations, with a few exceptions. However, so Article 2 is the real body of text in the law, but before the text of the law, there are recitals which give some information to help interpret the text of the law. And recital 103 says that AI components provided for a price or otherwise monetized will not benefit from the exceptions for free and open source AI components. So this is seems to be very unfortunate. Now, some of these terms are still pending a real explanation, and it's not completely clear yet what will be in and what will be out. However, this commercialization condition, it would be a unfortunate addition. Sometimes when there is discussion of creating obligations for software, sometimes it's proposed that the people who have the money should be the ones who pay for compliance, and there is a logic behind that. However, we also have to keep in mind that the ecosystem as a whole benefits from having as many companies and investors investing in our ecosystem. And so any clause that makes their work more difficult is something that is harming the entire ecosystem. So there are three categories which are not covered by that clarification. And so in these three categories, the obligations will apply even to free and open source software. And so the first category is high risk AI, and then there are lists and examples of what high risk AI is in the rest of the document. There are prohibited systems, and these are systems which are often in violation with human rights and are simply prohibited. And then there are a few specific systems which are listed in Article 50. So the other part of the AI Act, which is interesting for free and open source software, is this Article 25, which has the obligations of the various parties in the value chain. And so what's interesting is that at the end of this paragraph, it says that free and open source software is not subject to these obligations. And so in general, it's quite logical, since the idea is that if the source code is not available, then other people in the value chain may find it difficult to provide the necessary information. So once the source code is available, then it's not necessary to force each upstream entity in the value chain from providing this information. But the other way of looking at this is that this is also an incentive for people to publish their AI components as free and open source software. And so this lightens the regulatory burden somewhat for people who are publishing as free and open source software. So that's all I will highlight for the text itself. The reason is that there are many other presentations people can find online which go into individual legalistic details of the EU AI Act. So I've tried to just highlight the ones that are specific to the audience here. So in general, the things to retain are that it often will apply to free and open source software, and that many parts are unclear. The next part of the presentation now is about the the legislative context, because the text of the AI Act has been finished. However, that does not actually mean that the legislative package is finalized. So this is something that has always existed in EU law, but in the last 3 to 5 years, it seems to have become a lot more common. And that is the writing of laws, and then including clauses which will say that certain parts will be defined at a later stage, or will be subject to standards or guidelines, or that a new entity will be created to discuss how to apply certain obligations. So the way this works, and I'm going to give the first aspect I'm going to discuss is standards. So in software context, when we think of standards, we often think of data format standards, but for legislation, that's not the category of standards we're usually talking about. In legislation, it's usually a process standard. So people in the OpenChain community might be more familiar with that than most software developers. But the idea is that the legislation itself will contain a very brief explanation of what the requirements are for a software distributor, and then a standard will be developed to give a practical implementation of how you can comply with this obligation. So this would mean that the difficult way to comply with the regulation would be to open up the text itself of the AI Act and to read all the obligations and to think of your own way for how to comply with all these obligations. Then the simple way would be to look at the standards documents, which give you an example of how to comply with the obligations. And so the standards are developed at the request of the European Commission. And then once the standards are developed, they are then, they go through an approval process and they can be approved by the European Commission. And once they've been approved, you can comply with the standard. And if you do comply with the standard, you get a legal presumption that you're in compliance with the AI Act itself. So in the for the AI Act, there has been a request which has been drafted already from the European Commission. It's not final yet, but it was circulated last year and is currently being updated now. But it contains a list of 10 standards, which are on the screen, which it is requesting be developed by one of the approved EU standards organizations. And so these should give a practical implementation of the requirements. And our role as in terms of policy must be that we have to ensure that these standards can then be implemented by free and open source software. And so if there are any data format aspects of these standards, this would mean make sure there are no issues with copyright or patents. And then if they are process standards, then it will be questions such as, are there any requirements for non-disclosure agreements or any notification or registration requirements which may be simply too difficult or incompatible with our licenses? So this is the work that we will have to get involved in now in the next, I guess, probably 3 years. The timeline for the AI Act standards has not been published yet, but the obligations of the AI Act will come in bit by bit over the next 3 years, and so I guess the deadline for developing these standards will be matched to when the obligations are coming into effect. The second aspect which we will have to work on is guidelines, and so this is something that has also evolved in the last few years, it seems. Technically, the guideline documents have no legal impact on the substance of the law. However, it seems that more and more aspects that we would consider quite substantial are being pushed into these guidelines, and so it seems there is an understanding from the side of the European institutions that these guidelines will have some influence on the substance of the law. Now, whether people disagree with the legality of that is an interesting discussion. However, for a court case to resolve an issue would take quite a long time, and so we have to participate in the drafting of these guidelines under the assumption that they will have some legal or quasi-legal weight. So for one example is that there is recital 53, which suggests or recommends to the European Commission that they draft a guideline for a definition of high risk. And so this is particularly interesting because the clarification that free and open source software does not have to comply with the obligations doesn't apply to high risk systems. And so depending on whether or not high risk gets a broad definition, we will see whether the FOSS clarification ends up being broadened or narrowed by this guideline. So one interesting thing is what the part that I highlighted, which just explains what will be in the guideline. But then also the following line there mentions consulting with the board, and so I'll mention the board a little bit later. So as well as these procedures, the standards and guidelines, there are also various entities that are created. And one call, which the document calls the board and has the full title of the European Artificial Intelligence Board, will be made by one member of each member state, or one representative of each member state, plus the AI office, which I'll discuss on the next slide. And the goal of this entity is to, now, as you can see in the 4 sentences on the slide, is to advise and to make suggestions and give contributions to the various documents and implementation of the AI Act. So once again, this will have an impact on how broad or how narrow the regulation turns out to be. And this is something that we will have to see how we can work with this board and whether we can get in contact with the various representatives from the member states. The second major entity that is created is the AI office. And so this is an entity within the European Commission. So it's not an external, it's not autonomous, it is part of the European Commission. So whenever the AI office does something, it should be assumed that this is the European Commission is doing this. And so this, once again, will give input and comment on various implementation aspects of the EU AI Act. So the board is representative of the member states, and the AI office is representatives of the European Commission. Beyond this, there is also an advisory forum, and there's a scientific panel as well, and these are also involved in certain decisions. So with that, that is all I will say about the legal and legislative issues. The rest of the presentation then is about the technical aspects of AI and how it, in a more practical sense, applies to the practices of the free and open source software community and ecosystem. So one issue that came up many years ago is whether AI is software at all. And so this is important because our licenses talk about software and our definitions talk about software. And we often had definitions that would apply to the software and would not apply to, for example, configuration files or documentation. And it was generally considered that for a software package, it's not necessary that all the data related to the software package be distributed with the software package. And so if a business was developing a software package and they had their data that they used with that software package, there's no obligation for the business to also distribute their data. So we had this nice clear definition between software and data was usually considered quite a small aspect, and so it wasn't important to have the data. But it was small, and it was also usually specific to the user, to one user. So with AI, things are the other way around, because with AI, you have a very small piece of software which performs the training, and you have an extremely large body of data, which is the training data, and then this goes on to produce the weights and then the applications. I'll go into some technical details a little bit later, but I'm also trying to keep it a little bit high level so that I'm trying to find the balance between how much do we have to dig into and how much can we leave to more technical presentations. So for the AI system, one question is it software? Another question is, are parts of this software, or is the whole thing software? Or if parts are software, then which are the software parts? A third question then is, for us to treat an AI system as being a free or open AI system, what exactly do we need to have? And so for software, we knew what this was. This was the source code. But for an AI system, the only source code involved is in the training software. But this is a very small component, and on its own, it does nothing that would be expected from an AI system. So the question then is, what should we call the source code in context of expecting the source code to give us all of the benefits that we would expect from free and open source software? So the balance of trying to stay a little bit high level but also dig in to the details is important, because there are a lot of companies and projects which are publishing software and they're calling it open source AI or free software AI, and some would be seen as valid, and others would be seen as open washing or not really using the term correctly. So the issue with things being technically complicated is that it's very easy for somebody to suggest that the topic is too difficult or too complicated to be discussed at a technical level, and therefore to avoid discussion of the details of what is inside or outside the definition. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find a way to discuss AI systems that is simple enough that we can first off understand it ourselves, but more importantly, we can show it to policymakers and they can feel that they understand it. The current situation is that most policymakers do not understand how an AI system works. And so for them, if they don't understand the details, then what they'll hear is company X says A and company Y says B, and they'll have to evaluate based on which company they think is more honest, or which company is more important to their local economy, or whose message in general sounds more credible. So what we'd like to do is we'd like to try and get past the excuse of saying it's complicated, and we'd like to get it as simple as possible an explanation. Now, at the same time, unfortunately, it is complicated, and so we do have to. We don't deny that there can be different aspects that need more technical discussions. But I've tried to make the most basic diagram, which would explain a lot of what we have to discuss with policymakers. And so here it is. This is what I originally called the ridiculously simple explanation of AI. A lot of people would see this diagram and they would say that a certain thing has to be added. I'll give some examples in a minute. But I think that this diagram explains most of what needs to be understood by a policymaker who is faced with a policy question. So it shows that the software is only a very small component in this whole system, and it separates training data, software, weights, and app, because the training data is a separate block of data that doesn't need to be distributed in order for the system as a whole to be a free or open system. What seems to be becoming the consensus is that if the software and the weights are both free and open, then the AI system is free and open. And then for the app, that's a separate question. If the app is free and open, then that app is free and open. But so this is the explanation I've been using. Some people would say that it's missing the hardware aspect, because to train weights, you sometimes need extremely expensive hardware, and access to that hardware is difficult to obtain or expensive. However, that level of detail is not necessary for every discussion, and so I've left that out. Other people have pointed out that there is a feedback loop sometimes between the app and the weights, as the weights get constantly retrained by how the app is used. And again, that's true, but it's something that is not necessary for most of the discussions that I've seen. So this is the most basic presentation I've found, and hopefully, even if it's not sufficient on its own, hopefully it can be used as a starting point for when people do need something that is more detailed. So if you're in a situation where you have to draw a diagram on a board to start explaining something, then this could be the starting point. And then if the discussion is about hardware, the hardware can be added in, or if it's about feedback loops, that can be added in. So the reason that this discussion is so important is because time is constantly ticking on this issue. It's in some ways quite a new area of policy and technology. However, at the same time, the EU has already been trying to develop legislation for the past 3 years, and we'll continue those discussions for another 3 years or so, possibly longer if more legislation is then proposed. So the longer we wait, and the longer we go without a good definition of what is free software AI, the more chance that there will be laws created in various different parts of the world which may have a definition which doesn't work very well for us. So the EU already has the AI Act. There are other countries and regions in the world. It's probably quite a long list, so I'm not going to even try to list who's interested in AI legislation. But so that's something that's already happening, and we have to try and get our definition completed as quickly as possible with consensus within the ecosystem, so that it can then be presented to policymakers as a well-working definition. The second reason why it's important to work on this is that, in a timely manner, is that the various software projects are already dealing with the question of how do they distribute AI systems, what are the terms they apply, and what license issues pop up. So recently, the Gen 2 GNU Linux distribution and the NetBSD distribution have banned AI contributions. So I put banned in quotation marks because I'm not clear on whether they banned AI contributions to the software packages that they distribute, or just to their own software, which is used for gathering together these software packages for the operating system that each of these projects distributes. However, it does show that there is a fear or concern about code that is generated by AI, and this can be due to code quality issues. And so, we can see code that is generated which has logical errors in it, but these would be very difficult to spot if somebody doesn't read the code and understand the code. And often a code generator is often used because somebody doesn't have time to understand a certain aspect and to read all the necessary code. And so there are technical issues. There are also concerns about the copyright of AI contributions. So on one hand, we have software projects that are saying that they will ban AI contributions. On the other hand, I was at a meeting last year where I heard that the developers of the Linux kernel have been using machine learning for 8 years now to improve the security of the code in the Linux kernel. So, excuse me. So in that sense, so AI assisted or code that benefited from the use of AI is already in all our systems, and that is that's another thing that makes the time aspect crucial. So Gen 2 and NetBSD have announced that they will ban AI contributions. I've seen that Debian and Fedora are also discussing what to do with to make a policy on accepting or not AI. So one thing is that the open source initiative launched a project, I believe, at the end of 2022 to begin drafting an open source AI definition. So I've put the link there. No, it's not. I'm not sure if I can get it into the chat box here. But they've been touring around the world and discussing on mailing lists and turning up to events and trying to discuss this with as many people as possible. I put the link in the chat there. So at the moment they have a version 0.0.8, and this they say is feature complete, but still accepting input. I believe the timeline is that they will work on this until November of this year, and then hopefully they will be able to release a version 1.0 of their definition, and that would be then maintained in the future. They highlight that it is 1.0 because there may be updated versions in the future. This is partly because there might be issues that are only spotted after the definition is finished, but it's also because the technology will be changing. So if you have a definition that depends on discussions of training data and weights, then this might not work anymore in 5 years' time when maybe training data or weights is replaced by a different category of input. So the definition that they use in the OSI AI, the OSI open source AI version 0.0.8 is very similar to what we've always used for software. And so I think this was a good idea because in some ways the FOSS ecosystem has, it could be argued, has only ever created one definition in its 40 years of existence. There are various definitions for open content and open data and open standards and open science and lots of other topics. However, a lot of them wouldn't have universal acceptance. So the definition of free software that was created at the start of the 80s has managed to gain universal acceptance. And then in 1998, there was the open source definition, which was created and was similar in spirit, but people were a bit concerned that it might be interpreted differently, and that might lead to a split between things that are approved by according to FSF's definition and according to OSI's definition. However, very quickly, OSI approved virtually the same set of licenses as the Free Software Foundation had approved. And so in that way, we never had a split of that definition, even though those two names were created, but the definition stayed unified in its substance. And so now with the idea of open source AI, we can see that the definition is once again, it's keeping the original 4 criteria, and it's keeping the approach of thinking about what are the benefits that we would expect. And so rather than having a technical focus on trying to figure out what source code is, it has a focus on the outcome of how do we make sure that users can create modifications for their own purposes, or can study and can review what's in the software. So then the next most interesting aspect of this is that for these 4 criteria to apply, we generally have to have source code, at least for the criteria of studying and modifications. And so then this raises the question of what is source code for an AI system. Now, there's an interesting choice of words in the original. I'm not sure if it's in the free software definition or if it's in the GNU GPL, but it talks about the source code must be in the preferred form for modification. So the question then, if I go back to my ridiculously simple diagram, one question that was discussed for various years was, should it be required that the training data is made available if a system is to be declared a free or open AI system? So on one hand, an easy answer would be yes, let's require that, because you can't go wrong with asking for more. However, this raises a lot of practical issues, because the training data, sometimes it's extremely large and couldn't be transferred. Sometimes it doesn't exist anymore. If you trained an AI system by scanning a television channel, then the next day you don't have a copy of the data that was used to train your AI system. There can be issues with data privacy. If you're making a medical AI system, it's going to be very difficult or impossible to gather enough training data that can be distributed under a free or open license for medical purposes. Or if you have any data that would contain personal information or personal identification information, or even people's photographs, you generally won't be able to get enough data because it raises privacy issues. And then finally, another issue is simple ownership of the data. With software, we were able to define or set our own criteria, because we did that and then we developed the software. So once we developed the software, we could put our license on it. But with an AI system, the training data is often data owned by other people. And so we don't have the option of deciding what license to put on the training data. So in a practical sense, if we demanded the training data be open or free, so that the system could be called open or free, the end result would be that there would be very few systems which are open and free. So it would be practically very difficult. However, is it necessary? And so the consensus, and I have a few questions about this myself, but the consensus seems to be that the training data is not necessary. The weights are sufficient to allow for the four criteria there of use, study, distribute, and modify. So the way this works is that weights can be incrementally trained. So if you have a set of weights that performs a task and you notice that it doesn't perform the task in the way that you wish, then you can further train those weights and create your modified version based on that. Something, just because I'm not a specialist in developing AI systems, I have yet to give this a go and to try retraining a set of weights. So I have some questions myself about how practical it really is. But the consensus seems to be that this is sufficient. So I'll assume it is. But then the second reason why focusing on the weights is a good idea is that the word preferred form is a preferred form of modification. If you give somebody the training data, and if the training data contains billions and billions of information points, it's quite possible that using that training data to create a set of weights may be something that costs in the order of, more than a house. And so in that sense, providing somebody with the training data would actually be a way of not giving them the benefits of a free and open system, because you could say, well, I gave you everything I have. However, the recipient would not have the computing power necessary to perform the conversion then of that training data into the creation of a set of weights. So in that sense, if it's correct that it is technically sufficient to have access to the weights, it also seems that it is more practical for an AI system to be modified by modifying the weights which I understand is quite an easy, quite a light procedure in terms of the computing power necessary compared to the original generation of the set of weights. So it seems that the consensus could be that if the software and the weights are distributed in a way that meets those four criteria, then the system is an open source or a free AI system. And whether the training data is available or not, in some situations it might be nice to have. In some situations it would be almost useless, but it is in any case not a requirement and not relevant to the definition. The last topic I wanted to mention is on the issue of copyright, and that's simply because this gets raised in quite a lot of policy discussions. So there seem to be discussions about whether the owners of copyright on the training data would have any copyright claim to the output of the training software. So one argument in favor of maintaining copyright ownership from the training data and keeping that enforcing that also for the output of the training software would be that for free and open source software, our licenses, we would like them to apply to as much software as possible, usually, and so we would like that to apply to the output of an AI code generator, for example. And so this would be useful for our purposes because some of our licenses have copyleft clauses. So, for example, the GPL, the MPL, and Eclipse public license, they have requirements that derived works and works built on that source code is also distributed as free and open source software. And so, in that sense, we may wish that our copyright licenses for if our software is used as training data, then we'd like that to apply to the generated weights as well. And besides the copyleft clauses, there's also things like our patent grants. We would very much love for anyone distributing the generated software to also be affected by the patent grants, which protect downstream modifiers of the software. So those would be the benefits if copyright of the training data would mean that you also own copyright of the output of the training software. However, on the other hand, the practical downsides are quite extreme. For training AI systems, mostly very large sets of data are used, and there's a chance that there will be thousands or possibly even millions of copyright holders for all that training data. So tracking down or even tracing the ownership of all these fragments of information would be very difficult. The chance that you could confidently say that all the licenses are compatible and there's no licensing issues within all this data, that the chance of being able to say that is quite small. And it would also mean that for a lot of training data would be owned and licensed by companies, and that would mean that only very rich entities would be able to afford the top of the range training data. And so this would mean that in the free and open community, we could develop our own AI systems, but only using Wikipedia, Project Gutenberg, and a few other sources like that are available. And so we would only be able to develop quite limited types of AI and machine learning. So given this, the practical drawbacks, it seems the consensus is forming around the idea that it would be preferable for copyright on training data to not infer copyright ownership of the output of the training system, training software. Then from the legal point of view, the argument would be if I read 20 cookbooks and then I write my own cookbook, this is there's no copyright violation there unless I've copied sentences word for word. But if I've just absorbed the information and then I write my own cookbook, this is not a violation of copyright. And so the analogy would be that learning from a set of training data doesn't imply that what was learned is owned by the owner of the training data. So this would generally this would be how it gets explained. Now, I can see counter arguments, and there are some details I have to check on this, because we see news articles every week or two where companies that own images or text are claiming that their images or text were obviously used to train a certain AI system, and if they're able to spot that, then that would suggest that substantial parts of their original item are being reproduced by the even after passing through the training software. So that is something that that I would have to verify, but it seems there is this consensus form that it would be better for us if copyrighted training data was completely detached from copyright of the weights. So this would imply that this would imply that an AI system is a well-functioning AI system, in that it would, if you did have an AI system which was copying substantial fragments of the training data and putting them in the output, then that would be a poorly working AI system, and that could cause copyright issues. So the question of copyright may be more a question of how technically competent the AI system is, rather than our own policies. With that, I noticed that I'm drawing in on, I'm getting close to the finish of my allotted time. I did want to leave some time for questions. I have to say, as a caveat, I'm not an expert on each individual aspect that has been mentioned in the presentation. What I've tried to do is I've tried to go into just enough detail on each of the aspects so that the other aspects all make sense. I'm trying to raise the combined level of knowledge in that sense. But I will definitely take questions if there are questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Kieran. Everyone, you're welcome to ask questions by unmuting yourself or to type them in the chat. One thing I wanted to bring up, Kieran, which is maybe a sideways question. There was recently an AI conference here in Japan, and it was noted that a lot of the large language models being used are trained mostly on English language stuff. So for instance, they had some metrics on what they saw coming out of OpenAI and the amount of corpus it was using in Japanese, which appeared to be limited. So people have started to build large language models out of deeper corpus of things like Japanese text or Chinese text. I was just curious, as a side note, if it had come up in the context of the EU about LLMs using different language sets. And I raise this because, of course, the EU is quite well known for translating everything, including building an open source license and every language having an official version, as opposed to one being the reference and the rest just being a translation of a reference.
Yeah, so this is, it's not a topic that's getting much discussion, but the relevance that I would see is that this highlights the need for access to training data to be unrestricted, because it's already difficult to make a system using only free and open English texts. You can use the corpus of Creative Commons and Wikipedia, Project Gutenberg, and the European Commission's websites. That's all Creative Commons as well. So there are bodies of text that you can use. However, if you only have access to the freely available texts of the internet, you will have a much smaller set of data than you would if you could just scrape every single web page in existence. And so for English, this is already an issue. But for basically every other language, it's just going to be even more of an issue. The quality is going to get it's going to decrease a lot faster as the number of documents available shrinks. And so, one example would be the Irish language, where the number of texts online is quite small, and it's quite limited. You will find certain categories of texts. There are newspapers and there are laws and court rulings that have been translated, but you won't find certain other categories. There's not many pop songs written in the Irish language, for example. So yes, it is an issue, and the only thing we can do to address it from a policy point of view is to ensure that gathering of training data it can be done without needing to contact every single author or potential author of that training data.
Thank you, Kieran. And throwing open to everyone else, are there any final questions as we reach the end of this webinar? I noticed we had a few comments in the chat. Jimmy made a comment that he thinks that talking about open source as requiring exceptions is not optimal, he thinks. Maybe that, open source in the context of procurement and so on might need to be considered in ways that are slightly different to proprietary software, but the language of exceptions tends to get some tension from regulators and so on. Jack had made two comments. One was just a note that training data is helpful for modification, but the second is a question. And his question, which is our closing question for this event, is, will fine-tuning always result in a new GPAI model, thus making someone a provider? Or is there a similar concept to that of substantial modification as applies to high risk? Oh, that's interesting. So will fine-tuning a model make you a creator, or is it just adjusting the configuration a bit?
Yeah, so there are 4 words in that question that would require research, basically, to figure out what they mean and what their scope is. So I'm just going to dodge that question. Unfortunately, these are things that we don't really know at this point. We are still waiting on the standards, the guidelines, and hopefully we'll get enough clarification from those. If we don't, then we'll still be waiting after that for possibly case law and best practices, and to see what the industry and what software projects and what software users actually do in practice. So these things, at this stage, they don't have a clear and concise answer. So we'll be working on it for the years to come. Can I? Is there 30 seconds so I can reply quickly to the first comment from Jack about the training data?
Of course.
You mentioned that training data is helpful for modification, and well, it can be, but it depends on the type of AI system, and as training data starts becoming huge, it becomes less useful. Now, this may change in the future. It may be the case that computing power takes a huge leap forward and then outpaces the growth of training data, and maybe it'll become easy for people to use an entire body of training data. It's difficult to know where this will go in the next 5 or 10 years, but for the moment, it seems that we can sacrifice training data without losing much, and that we can focus on weights and get probably everything we need. But these are still open for discussion. Please do take a look at Open Source Initiative's work. They're open to discussion. And to Jimmy's comment about an exemption may not be the best path. Sometimes we don't have the choice of what exact format the discussion happens in. Sometimes the policymakers have decided this is how they're going to deal with it, and we might quickly suggest a different approach. and they might say not interested, and then we'll talk to them about what they are willing to do. So that's yeah, that's sometimes the reason for going for exemptions. But yeah, that's we are at time, so I will leave it there.
Kieran, thank you so much. And thank you to our audience. It's been a great presentation and, of course, helps to fill out the larger work we're doing around AI. This is the beginning, not the end, as Kieran suggested. We're still filling out this area. There's a lot to do. Kieran, we'll have you back shortly, talk about product liability in June. And for the rest of you, I'll catch you on the monthly calls. Have a beautiful day, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.